Welcome back to our fifth topic in our General Music K through 8 PLC. This topic is all about differentiation, and in this segment, we're going to be talking about flexible grouping. Let's start by talking about what is flexible grouping. So, flexible groupings are not fixed groups every time. In a lot of other classes, you'll have the jellyfish and the goldfish and the starfish. And those will be fixed groups every single time. This happens a lot in math and this happens a lot in reading. But flexible grouping changes based on the skill or the content or the process that you're doing that day. Like we just talked about in our previous segment, a lot of this is data driven, and a lot of students have different skills with music and they have different strengths and different weaknesses. So depending on what you're doing that day, they might be in a more advanced group, they might be in a group that needs more support. It might not even be a group of students. It might be varying levels of difficulty or varying levels of complexity, and each individual student is doing their own thing, but maybe there's 3 levels. So you've got kids over here who are doing a mixture of things and kids over here doing a mixture of things, but each individual student is doing 1 of 3 things. It's data driven, meaning that you're using that data from the assessment that we talked about in segment 1 to create these groups, and you can assign them, or sometimes you are able to provide choices and the students can select which group or which level they want to be in for themselves. And it can be either homogeneous, meaning everyone in the same group has the same skill level, or heterogeneous, meaning in each group, there's students of varying skill levels. So now that we know what flexible grouping is, let's talk about different ways you can create flexible grouping. You can differentiate by content, process, and product, again, either in actual groups with several students at once, or offering these different groupings and different options, and then students choose to opt in to a specific option, putting them in that group, even if they're not physically working in a group. We're going to talk about some examples of homogeneous and heterogeneous grouping, and I'll give you some examples of what it looks like for students to have choices in grouping. So here are some ideas for differentiating content. You can have simplified parts or more advanced parts where maybe the standard you're working on that day is performing a melody. So you can have groups that are playing a 3-pitch melody, and then maybe some groups that are playing a 5-pitch melody. They're both achieving the same goal, but the specifics of the content that they're achieving is different. You can also modify the rhythm or movements for students who need extra support. So like if you're doing a folk dance in a circle and there is a do-si-do, a do-si-do might be kind of hard for some students to think about that circle going back to back. So you might just allow them to walk in a circle and turn their shoulders. That's an example of a movement modification. And then you can also expand the rigor. So for example, you can have students create new parts and create their own parts while the rest of the class is working on the parts that they're still working on learning. Maybe you can have a student who has got the singing part down to go ahead and start playing an instrumental accompaniment while the rest of the class is still working on the singing part. So you're offering individual choices, but students who are maybe ready for that expanded rigor might be in that group. So that's an example of why students are not necessarily working in a group without teacher support, but you're still able to group them and offer these varying levels of differentiation. Another way to differentiate is by the process, and we do this a lot in music. So we might be able to add extra practice time for students who need that time in the process. Or flexible pacing is where either an individual or a group can move on to the next step if they're ready for it, but groups or individuals who are not ready can continue working on that same one. You can offer visual aids to students who need it. Maybe you're learning an instrumental part and they can't quite remember how the rhythm goes, so you can offer them a visual aid of the rhythm, even if it's a iconic version of that rhythm. That's another way to differentiate the process. You can help scaffold before moving to the next step. So an example of this is before moving to an instrument like a xylophone that has several pitches, you can have them play a melody with a single pitch instrument like a boomwhacker, so they kind of get a better idea of how that note fits in the melody before being able to expand to playing more pitches in that melody. You can also offer hand over hand assistance. I do this a lot with that crossover Bourdon on the xylophone where students have a hard time with that movement. I'll ask them if I can help them and hold their hands and show them how to play it to give them that physical feel of what it should feel like on the instrument. Another differentiation of process is to assign peer leaders, where once they have accomplished their goals, they can be the conductor or they can help teach their neighbor how to play the part. And then maybe you can offer advanced notation. So like instead of just doing a single measure in isolation, you can show what a rhythm might look like in a piece of orchestral music on a score. And then you can also differentiate by product. So in this, you still want to make sure that the students are achieving the standard, but the parameters for how they do so can change. So for example, if they're composing, maybe you ask them to use only a half note, quarter note, and eighth notes, but some students can also add in 16th notes. Or maybe you ask them to only compose 4 measures, but some students can compose 8. Maybe you ask them to perform only the A section of a song instead of trying to learn the whole song. Or maybe you ask them to only play 1 chord on the ukulele and then rest when it switches chords. So they're still getting the experience of performing the song, or they're still getting the experience of performing on the ukulele, but they have a differentiation where they don't have to worry about switching chords or learning the whole song. And you can also have them perform additional parts of the song. You can ask them, if you're having the whole class play just 1 chord or the other, maybe you can invite particular students to perform both chords or perform all sections of the song. So homogeneous grouping is one of the most recognizable forms of differentiated instruction. So when your admin comes into your building or into your classroom and they see you doing this, they're going to know right away what you're doing. In the next segment, I'm going to talk about some maybe less familiar versions that your admin may not be familiar with of how we can differentiate in different ways, but this is the number one way that they're going to recognize. So in homogeneous grouping, you've got level groups where all the members are on the same or similar level, and each group is given variations on the process or product. So you can say that this group is going to work together to create a brand new section. And this group is going to work together to learn both sections that we've already learned. And then maybe your lowest group, who needs the most support, is going to work directly with the teacher. And you're going to help them learn a single part. So it's varying levels of support. In heterogeneous grouping, you've got groups that are made up of students of various abilities and skill levels. So you can use that data that you got from that assessment and say that I know Johnny has a great understanding of this concept, but maybe Susie needs some help, so I'm going to pair them together in the same group. Or maybe I know that Betty is a great singer and Billy is really good at playing instruments, so I'm going to put them together to help each other. And this is where you can get those peer helpers and you can get that pair and share going on. Another way to differentiate is by student choice. So you can let the students self-select based on their interest or their own perceived skill levels. So maybe I have a similar type of rhythm, but different instruments for it. I'll let the students choose which instrument they want to play. Or if I've got a song where I'm having some people play instruments and some people sing and some people move, I'll maybe let my students select which part they want to be involved in. As I discussed in the last topic, I have an example where I do rhythm notation and I give the students either pre-written notation cards or popsicle sticks or a dry erase board, and they get to choose which manipulatives they want to use. I also sometimes let my students have a choice of whether they want to work alone or with a group. So some students are ready to work by themselves. They don't need anybody else helping them. They've got their own ideas, and I allow that to happen. And then some students prefer to work with a group and bounce their ideas off others. I always tell them that if you want to work in a group, you have to work with someone who also wants to work in a group. You can't work with someone who wants to work alone because we have to honor that choice. And you can choose from varying levels of difficulty. So maybe, for example, with the ukulele, I'll say you can either play this chord, or you can play this chord, or you can play both chords in the song and switch back and forth. And again, I make it clear that this is an individual choice. It's not like a class vote or anything. If they want to try to take on that challenge, they can. If they're nervous about that challenge, they don't have to do it. And that kind of opens the door to differentiation. It's also going back to assessment. I like to look at what choice the students are making and seeing if they can handle that choice. And maybe, for example, going back to the dry erase board, if I see that someone's having a really hard time drawing the notes, I might walk over to them and say, and suggest that they try one of the other manipulatives. So I can assess in the moment whether that choice is working for them. So this is flexible grouping for differentiation. In the next segment, we'll talk about whole group grouping and whole group differentiation and what that might look like, and how to help your administration recognize what that looks like, because in our class, it's going to be a lot different than in other classes.